We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Now, we've been joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza, for the show. And we've been talking free speech, First Amendment at home and abroad. But now, Scott, I'd like to discuss something of equal importance, and that's the Joe Biden administration push to, and I'm going to, for those of you just listening on the radio here, I'm going to use the air quotes thing, reform the Supreme Court. What's the latest there?
The scare, SCAIR
quotes.
Quotes. Yeah, indeed. It's, I'm not a political analyst for the site, but I do kind of pay attention to political matters. It does seem a bit weird that as he's going out the door on a lack of
support,
mental acuity, and kind of dexterity wave, I think is fair to say, right? That's why Joe Biden is not, at least publicly stated, that's why he's not the nominee. That there's a massive push for this thing that, America has not been clamoring for, which is a constitutional amendment changing how the United States Supreme Court works. And what we don't have is, of course, I shouldn't say of course, what we don't have is the actual amendment proposed. It would be like me saying, Mark, we should have an amendment that, and just insert whatever you and I might think is a laudatory goal, but then not discuss what the actual terms of the amendment are. And what's kind of preposterous about that for anybody who spends a lot of time looking at these issues like I do is this simple, a one-word insertion or deletion in an amendment can change everything about it. The Supreme Court's wrestling with, or politicians wrestling with what a well-regulated militia means, for instance, in the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, it seems obvious to me that the founders meant that people shouldn't have their rights to firearms abridged by legislation or the government. And that seems very clear. But somehow for massive numbers of people who were law professors, governors, and presidents of the United States, it meant some kind of state militia thing. So the idea that you can just put out a laudatory goal, even though I don't think it is laudatory, there are three provisions of the amendment that Biden has asked for, which is one that gives term limits for Supreme Court justices, the idea being that every person who serves as a four-year president would get, I think, 2 appointments. And the second one is that there be no, it's so funny too, because they're not in the same bucket. In other words, there are 2 provisions that deal with the Supreme Court itself, term limits and also the imposition of the second is so there's the introduction of this code of conduct. So with term limits and code of conduct, those are how the Supreme Court, itself is constructed. And then the third thing is no immunity for former presidents. Now, I don't know if that's supposed to be backdated so that they can then throw Donald Trump in prison for something they haven't been able to throw him in prison for, or frustrate some future attempt at running for office. But in any case, those are the 3 things. And you start tinkering around with the court, and who knows what you're going to get. I think that the impetus is, though, what you're not going to get is what you have now, which is a conservative majority issuing forth decisions that conservatives are generally pleased with, and that frustrate those who have had for generations the court kind of rubber stamping their idea about how the Constitution should go, namely majority lefty courts that were not assertive of the right to keep and bear arms, for instance, or restrictive of abortions, which we currently see the court's composition leaning towards.
So there's a few things to unpack there, Scott. The first one is, if this really meant something to President Joe Biden, why didn't he do it when he first got into office? Why didn't he, in fact, campaign on it? And why didn't he do it when he had actual power before he became, quite honestly, the lamest of lame duck presidents that is.
Mark, he was busy
possibly ever
saving the
been.
economy, right? What did he say?
Yeah, 20% cumulative inflation. How's that going, Mr. President? So, I mean, obviously that's a blasé answer, and
Yeah, but
obviously
what would it have
intended
been?
seriously.
That's what you haven't looked at.
What would it have been?
No, I'm kidding. Of
It was
course.
what 1.4, I believe, was what it was.
Yeah.
Not the
The
9%.
thing about not campaigning on it, I think, is fascinating. Like the idea, and if we look at the compliant press, the big bucks media, the way they've treated the story, I think is fascinating in the sense of if the United States of America once wishes to change the composition of the Supreme Court, wouldn't that be, to use their language, worthy of a conversation over the course of maybe multiple election cycles and including vigorous debates on all the different provisions that might be established to change the court, and then look at what their downstream consequences might be, and then of course debating the specific language involved to be able to articulate those things and try to weigh in on them. But with this, it's none of it. It's just, here are some ideas that I think are laudable, so let's support an amendment that's unwritten to somehow institute them. It's kind of preposterous, honestly. Except that it's scary as hell because it could happen. In other words, who knows what could actually occur.
Here's the sniff test, as it were. It's an interesting hypothetical that should be applied to the similar principles should be applied to pretty much every far-reaching decision that you suspect of being started through a bias, a political bias, and that is, here you go. I'll run this by you, and you put on your progressive hat if you've got one. So let's say that this all happens and Joe Biden gets his wish, and each president can appoint two, or each president per term presumably can appoint two new Supreme Court justices. Now, let's say that, just for example, Donald Trump wins in this November, and he gets to appoint two more, and he appoints conservative justices that are far to the right of anybody, even Clarence Thomas, right? And then in 2028, Ron DeSantis comes in, or J.D. Vance comes in, wins 2 terms. So that's another 6 justices, all to the right of Clarence Thomas. And then somebody else comes in, Vivek Ramaswamy comes in, and he wins in...
This just sounds like a fever dream.
And he wins, and he appoints 2 more and 2 more.
Uh-huh.
At that point, do they still say this is a good idea? Do the people who are proposing it now say it's a good idea?
It doesn't pass the laugh test. All you have to do is see when these proposals came out. It's in response to decisions that were off-putting to the people who are making the case for the change. So
yeah, if the answer is no, it's a purely selfish, self-serving.
Yes, they don't like the result. They want to get a different result. This is the way to get the quickest way to get a different result. And also, maybe they don't get their new justices, but maybe some justices change their votes. We know that Chief Justice Roberts, is susceptible to media portrayals of his helming of the court, and famously switched his vote in the Obamacare decision, had ruled it unconstitutional in the face of a withering criticism that he might do just that. He switched his vote to say that it was legal to require Americans to buy health care insurance or have to pay up if they didn't.
Never make wild wishes, because you never know if they're going to come true. Scott Cosenza, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to thank our guest for today, Scott Cosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, and of course extend my gratitude to you at home for taking the time to tune in and either listen to us live on the Radio America Network or see us on catch-up on the pages of libertynation.com, on your Roku channel, on Amazon Fire, YouTube, Rumble, X, we're on them all. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.